Welcome to the CMS, or the Carbon Monitoring Systems Application Policy Speaker Series. And this is co-hosted by the Joint Global Carbon Cycle Center. They're kind enough to provide coffee and refreshments, so please help yourself. The CMS Policy Series brings external entities, whether they're commercial, university, federal, but they bring outside users to Goddard so we can have a better understanding of what the use of carbon products and remote sensing are like outside of the research environment. And we're trying to really expand the use of CMS products and really identify some synergies with different end users and partners out there. Today we have a fantastic commercial entity known as BlueSource joining us to give the talk. Now, BlueSource is the longest running carbon offset developer and marketer in North America. They go back to about 1996. And we have Jeff Cole, who is the VP of Portfolio Development out of San Francisco, California, and Kevin Townsend, the Chief Commercial Officer out of Salt Lake City, Utah. Both of these gentlemen are joining us remotely, and they're going to talk to us about BlueSource, any synergistic opportunities they see with using remote sensing for their particular company, especially in terms of forest carbon, and that's it. I'm going to let them really tell you all about it. So Jeff and Kevin, if you would like to speak up, I will go ahead and mute myself and let you guys have the floor.
Very much, Vanessa, and really thank you to all the folks at NASA for having us. It's really an honor to be presenting to you all today, so we're really appreciative of the opportunity. We decided to title the talk "When New Carbon Markets and New Technologies Meet." And, you know, carbon markets have actually been around in one form or another for about the past 20 years, but they're still very new and nascent and developing. And they can be a complex animal. And so we would like to maybe just start off by trying to simplify it a bit, and then really directing the focus of the conversation toward forest carbon's role in the various carbon markets around the globe, but primarily here in North America. And then we'll, as Vanessa mentioned, we will talk about what we think remote sensing has to offer the space. We think there's some pretty tremendous value there, but also quite a bit of challenges and obstacles to overcome. And so after I give just a brief introduction of BlueSource and carbon markets and what forest carbon is and its role, then I'll turn it over to my much more knowledgeable and capable colleague, Jeff, and we'll finish it up there. And we should, at the end of this, have plenty of time for Q&A. So just, again, looking at today's agenda, I've kind of covered this already, so then we'll just move on to the next slide here. So who is BlueSource? We were formally organized in 2001, but as Vanessa mentioned, we conducted our first sale of voluntary carbon, our first voluntary carbon trade in North America back in '96. We have almost 20 years of experience in doing this. And since that time, we've been involved in over 200 projects and have created or helped create over 100 million tons of offsets. We have offset projects in nearly all 50 states and most Canadian provinces. And we have more forest carbon offsets generated than any other North American firm. The map over to the right just shows you most of our U.S.-based forest projects. And if you were to go to our website, this would be an interactive Google map. But here it's just an image of that. But you can see some of the projects that we've been involved in. And you can also see a couple of them in Pennsylvania, which I believe is how we came to be on this call speaking to you today. So what does BlueSource do? Well, again, carbon markets are fairly complex. So ultimately, we are trying to bring a bit of simplicity to this complex world. And we want to leverage the carbon markets and what they have to offer to incentivize change, to incentivize action at businesses, landowners, or other entities that have the ability to reduce emissions and need a financial incentive to do so. That's really why the carbon markets exist. And that's a big part of why BlueSource exists as well. For carbon buyers, again, we try to simplify these markets and distill them down to actionable items for companies that either wish to do good and wish to address their carbon footprints, or those that are required to for regulatory purposes. So what is an offset and what is an offset market? An offset, a carbon offset, quite simply, is a reduction of greenhouse gases, and the unit of measurement is a metric ton of CO2 equivalent, and that equivalency is based on its certain substances' level of harm in the atmosphere compared to CO2. If you think of CO2 as a unit of one arbitrary unit, then everything else is measured as a multiple of CO2. It does have to meet a series of criteria. And ultimately, an offset is created by one entity, but it's transferred to another entity and then ultimately retired. And retirement is where there's truly an environmental benefit created. That's where you achieve the permanence of a reduction. If a reduction is created in my office and then I transfer it to Jeff's office and he transfers it back to me and then somewhere else, it can bounce around a community of buyers. But until it's actually retired or canceled or surrendered, there are a couple different words for it, that's the point at which a true environmental benefit is created, and that emission reduction can no longer be transferred to anyone else. So what criteria must be met for an offset? And I've listed 6 criteria here, and different folks will tend to view them differently, but they're usually derivatives of these 6 things. Real means that the emission reduction has to be real. It cannot be theoretical. That's a pretty easy one to grasp. Permanent means that it cannot be reversed or released. It has to be a real and non-temporary solution. Measurable and verifiable both speak to quantitative aspects, ensuring that we know exactly what is being reduced and what has been reduced. And then surplus and additional can sometimes work hand in hand. But what they mean is that it's the result of an action that is taken beyond what would have been done anyway in the course of business as usual. And I realize that may have been a mouthful, but what surplus typically means is that it's beyond what is required by existing regulations. So it is a voluntary action. It's an action that's undertaken not as a result of a requirement to reduce emissions. And additional, again, speaks to the fact that it would not have occurred anyway in the course of business as usual. So what is a carbon market? There are a lot of them across the globe. There are probably about a dozen. But fundamentally, it's simply a group of buyers. That's what comprises any market. But it's a group of companies or individuals that are looking for cost-effective means. And I do want to highlight that because that is fundamentally why offsets exist, is because they are the result of people searching for the most cost-effective means to reduce emission reduction. And in Jeff's office, he may have a lower cost of emission reductions than I have in mine. And so you can basically seek to achieve the same environmental benefit in the most cost-effective way possible. And these are, again, done either out of internal motivations or regulatory requirements. I've given here a few examples of carbon markets around the world, and with respect to North America in particular, we really have 2 markets. We have voluntary markets and we have compliance markets. I put voluntary at the top because, not because it's more important than compliance, but just because it's easier to explain. and there's basically only one of them. But a voluntary market, again, is driven by corporate social responsibility, internal sustainability, or maybe it's even just a pass-through of environmental benefits to a consumer base that requires or appreciates an environmentally conscious product. So it's a carbon-neutral product or a supply chain. Compliance markets tend to be more complex, but are also much larger. And when we think about truly global impacts on the issue of climate change, they're arguably more important because of the scale. And the most important compliance market that we have in North America right now is arguably the linkage between California and Quebec. There are discussions about potential future linkages with Ontario as recently as this week. But basically, California has a near economy-wide cap-and-trade program that facilitates the use of offsets, and forestry offsets play a meaningful role in that from around the country. The next one on the list is RGGI, or RGGI, which is a conglomerate of northeastern states that is a cap-and-trade program that is limited to the power sector but is not economy-wide. You also have similar programs in Alberta and British Columbia. And then I put a bullet on here for pre-compliance, which is an interesting topic today in light of the Clean Power Plan. Pre-compliance essentially is a voluntary market that anticipates a compliance market. And so some of the requirements that compliance buyers would typically have may be prevalent in states or in regions that don't currently have a cap-and-trade market but believe that one may be coming in the future. International is a bit more of a complex animal. I've listed some of the markets here, but if there are any questions about those, we'd be happy to field them at the end, but I think I'll move on for now. So let's talk about forest carbon's role in the carbon markets. Forest carbon is a very good fit for voluntary buyers in particular because of an emphasis that voluntary buyers often have on co-benefits. Voluntary buyers are often looking for, when they purchase an offset, they're looking to know what else does that offset do besides reduce 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent. And forestry credits typically offer biodiversity, preservation or enhancements, local water quality benefits, some community benefits such as recreation, and then sometimes in instances, especially in international instances, they may provide some specific economic benefits to communities through job creation or preservation of culture in some indigenous areas. When we look at forest carbon's role in California, this is a big emphasis for Blue Source right now, and it offers several advantages or several attractive attributes to the California market. For one, it has high volume projects, so each project can produce anywhere from a few 100,000 tons all the way up to several million tons. And when there are a community of buyers that have very big, very large, and very costly compliance obligations, it's attractive to be able to work with high volume projects. Also, carbon transactions are very, very complex and costly. They're costly from a legal standpoint, they're costly from a due diligence standpoint. They're just fundamentally very difficult to understand, and forestry is no exception to that. So to have some scale behind a project can be really beneficial, and so that's one of the reasons why forest carbon is very important to the California compliance market. Another reason why it's important, and this is illustrated in the graph on the right, is that the sector has a high potential for volume. And forestry is represented by the orange bar. And admittedly, this is an outdated supply projection, but the fundamental theory of supply for offsets into the California market is not really changed. And as you can see, that orange bar in the middle representing forestry is the largest source of potential offsets for the California program. And it's also a source that continues to grow over time, whereas some of the other higher volume contributors will tend to taper off. Looking at the bottom graph, the bottom slice there, which is ODS, there's simply a fundamental shortage of ODS that will be realized over time, the physical substance. There are also regulatory conformance issues, which is a very hot button topic with respect to the California carbon markets. And forestry offers some, I would say, differences, not necessarily advantages or disadvantages, but some differences related to other offset types. So let's look at some of the disadvantages of forest carbon offsets, and this is with respect to both the voluntary and compliance markets. One is that there's a very high cost of development. It is very, very typical to be required to spend several $100,000 or upwards of $500,000, even approaching the 7-digit numbers, just to get credits to market. There is a very manual, labor-intensive process that goes into verifying projects for their validity as well as the offsets themselves, and there are very high ongoing costs as well. They are highly complex and specialized, and they have a long path to market. It's not uncommon for forest carbon projects to take years before their first credits are issued, which can be an extremely difficult hurdle for investors to overcome. And those investors are really important because they are the ones that are making the decision to be willing or not to reduce those emissions. So again, going back to Blue Source's purpose, we want to leverage the carbon market to incentivize emission reductions, and the way you do that is by providing attractive investment opportunities. They're also highly complex for buyers to understand. As I mentioned a few moments ago, buyers are very focused on due diligence, and forest carbon quantification is highly specialized and highly complex. It's also very difficult for landowners to be incentivized when some of the restrictions that they have to place on their property must be met. Most notably, there are typically 100-year commitments for some voluntary and the California Compliance Program, and that's a big pill to swallow for a landowner who's thinking about not only their future livelihood, but those of their children, and grandchildren, and potentially great-grandchildren, having to live with some of these decisions that they make. So that's a big barrier to overcome. And lastly, there are monitoring challenges and monitoring expenses. And with this, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, because this is a great segue to talk about what is the current lay of the land in terms of quantifying and monitoring forest carbon, and what are some things that could be done in the future. So Jeff, please take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. So want to take a little bit of time and just look at what types of properties and what types of projects actually are eligible under this market. And I'm focused, in this case, primarily on the California cap-and-trade market. And as Kevin alluded to, it's the highest volume market currently that U.S. forest owners can engage with. And because of the design of the California program, there's relatively high carbon pricing, currently in the $10 per ton range that's been strong for a couple years now and shows signs of continued strength going forward. So most of what you're going to hear described in terms of project specifics relate to California cap-and-trade. That is a good baseline or benchmark to keep in mind as you're thinking about how to fit in with different programs, because California is probably the most important and also the most rigorous, and if you can make it work under the California program, you can probably make it work in almost any other one. So just a quick bit of background. There's three types of forest carbon offset projects eligible within California. The first is reforestation, planting trees where none have existed for at least the last 10 years. Avoided conversion projects where there's forest which has highest and best use, which is something other than forest, agriculture, residential development, commercial, something or other. And the landowner is willing to basically commit to not pursuing any use other than forest management on that property. And then the final type is improved forest management. This is far and away the largest and most widespread type of project opportunity in the country. These are projects on working forest lands that everyone presumes would always remain working forest lands, but the landowner is committing to keeping carbon levels above and beyond what would be considered the common practice baseline. So those are the three buckets, and your project needs to fit into one of those. There is also an urban forestry protocol, but there hasn't been a lot of activity pursued under that for a variety of reasons. The eligibility projects need to be located in the lower 48 states and in Alaska, and there's fairly important considerations around natural forest management. The biggest one is it has to be essentially be native species and a diversity of native species. Sustainable harvesting, if there is commercial harvesting, the easiest way to demonstrate that is through some form of third-party certification. And these acts in the sustainable harvesting at least needs to be undertaken on other properties owned by the project owner as well. The project owner needs to demonstrate clear title and ownership of the carbon benefits and carbon credits that are generated. and that can be on either eased or uneased lands, at least for improved forest management projects. So, as Kevin mentioned, the biggest requirement, the biggest hurdle that we work with landowners to get beyond is the 100-year commitment, and that amounts to periodic measurement, verification, and compensating for reversals for 100 years after you've sold your last carbon credits. Compensation is due only for intentional reversals, i.e. harvest. Things like forest fires or infestations are covered through a joint buffer pool that all projects contribute to. So it's often compared to a conservation easement, and it's fairly compared in some respects. However, unlike a conservation easement, it can be terminated at any point in time. And you can subdivide and sell portions of the property or the entire property, but these 100-year commitments transfer with the ownership. Otherwise, the current owner is liable for basically a project termination. And then also, unlike an easement, the owner can, in fact, exit at any time, so long as they pay back all the credits which have been issued to the project. And in the case of improved forest management projects, there is a penalty which starts at about 40% and then drops to 0% over the first 50 years. Is owed as well. And so one way that a lot of landowners, get comfortable thinking about this 100-year commitment is by looking at the cost of an endowment set aside in the first year of the project, necessary to cover the 100-year expenses of this long-term measuring and verification. So that, as Kevin mentioned, this, the carbon project gets passed on, hopefully, as an asset associated with the property, offering a new option now to sell timber or sell carbon and kind of move back and forth between those markets, with hopefully all of the long-term expenses associated with it covered out of the more certain and knowable early years of carbon revenue. One other thing to keep in mind beyond the 100-year commitment, there is also an invalidation period that ranges from 3 to 8 years, depending how many times you send out field verifiers. And during that time period, if it's found that a issuance was off materially by more than 5% due to bad information or bad calculations, the credits can be invalidated. And so under the regulation, the purchaser and user of the credits, not the forest owner, is liable for the invalidation risk, but that is something that everybody involved in projects needs to understand. So again, this was based primarily around the California compliance market requirements. There are also a variety of carbon project protocols that have been developed by the Verified Carbon Standard, VCS, American Carbon Registry, ACR, and Climate Action Reserve, CAR, that can be used for projects that are sold into voluntary markets. So it'd be worth having a look at some of the specifics in that as well. So as a result of all of these requirements, as well as the development expenses associated with the project, the bottom line is currently under both compliance markets and voluntary markets, you need some significant scale in order for a carbon project to work. And so, we've occasionally in avoided conversion projects as small as 1,000 acres, say a avoided conversion to agriculture can work. And sometimes, a 3,000 acre improved forest management project can work, but those typically have to be really heavily stocked forests. And what you see more typically is, a few thousand acres of avoided conversion and, 10,000 acres of improved forest management are where things begin to get kind of reliably interesting for people. So the improved forest management projects we mentioned, again, the nice thing about these projects are if you have a well-stocked property that's above the average calculated for your type of forest in your part of the country, you can receive essentially the entire amount of that surplus carbon or that delta to the baseline in the form of carbon credits on the first day of the project. So it really, has just great economic effects, being able to, legitimately monetize that asset early in the project. So that's a great thing. And then on an ongoing basis, harvesting is assumed to occur, but it doesn't occur in all cases. Whether or not harvesting goes on, as years go by, as long as harvesting is less than growth, there will be net carbon accumulation, and you can continue to sell carbon credits based on that net carbon accumulation over time. And as you can see, the numbers can get meaningful on an absolute per acre basis, particularly, when there is significant acreage involved. The other type of project we mentioned was avoided conversion. Again, there's a more limited set of opportunities for this project type. You need to, again, demonstrate that there is a higher and better use other than producing timber on this property, and the value of that alternative use needs to be at least 1.8 times the value of working timberland. You can get by with a lower multiplier than that, but in that case there would be penalties that need to be assessed against the project. And so in these avoided conversion projects, you can essentially take, in some cases, up to 100% or almost 100% of the standing carbon over the course of 10 years that would be lost if that property were converted. And as in an improved forest management project, you can also sell ongoing net growth year on year as additional carbon credits. So typically they're smaller properties, but there's more carbon potential per acre. So this next slide describes the carbon project development process, and these are the steps that basically any project under any of these markets goes through in one form or another. But starting with a feasibility assessment, looking at the eligibility and potential volume of a project. There's legal work, appraisal work. The big first stage of the project is really developing a forest carbon inventory. Typically Blue Source develops and designs the inventory methodology and then works with either internal or outside foresters on going and implementing that inventory and doing the field work. That data comes back from the field. It's converted into current carbon stocks and current carbon projections going forward, and ultimately converted from these gross carbon benefits to net carbon benefits after accounting for inventory uncertainty, leakage in the form of increased harvesting on other properties, what gets stored in wood products, and accounting for the reversal risk through natural events like fire or wind or infestation. With the models in place, we can move to complete project documentation, consolidating all of the carbon models as well as proof of eligibility in a single document that gets verified. And then the verification process itself, there's a limited number, I believe around 8 currently, different organizations which have been accredited to perform verification under at least the California program. And they come on site, sample a subset of inventory plots to confirm that your field measurements and subsequent calculations are all on track. And it's a very involved process and can go on for months, and they really do look under the hood and kick all the tires. And we certainly view that as a valuable part of the process for all parties. That really deep and intense look by a real group of experts helps everybody in the end. Finally, carbon credits need to be registered with one of 3 registries: Climate Action Reserve, Verified Carbon Standard, American Carbon Registry can all register ARB carbon offsets, and then those credits can be marketed and sold to the buyers that Kevin mentioned earlier. And it still is a very over-the-counter market for these offset credits. An offset is not an offset, and the purchasers spend a lot of time doing due diligence on the project itself, as well as the person that they're buying, or the entity that they're buying the carbon credits from. And then on an ongoing basis, there is annual monitoring and reporting. That gets back to the long-term 100-year obligation, and that basically breaks down into submitting a report annually as to how carbon stocks are known or at least modeled to have changed within the last year. Then every 6 years, you need to hire one of those accredited verifiers to come back again, pick a random subset of plots from the inventory and make sure that your current estimates are still on track. And then every 12 years, there's a requirement that you actually do go back and resample each of the inventory plots. And it's the areas with the stars, the 1 or 2 stars to the right, represents the areas where theoretically remote sensing can really have the biggest impact on improving efficiency and cutting project development costs. So that's the opportunity, and that's the area where new technologies really are needed to cut costs and enable increased adoption of carbon projects. But there are a number of barriers, and in talking to people about this, more than one person mentioned, this would be fantastic, but it needs to be as long as the science is there. And there doesn't seem to be a consensus, really, at least among people active in the carbon market, for what that actually means. So, that's both an opportunity and a challenge. I think there are very differing prospects for its use in different aspects of carbon measurement, either the upfront inventory, the ongoing monitoring, or the periodic verification. And there could really be differences in how things get treated both during the pre- and post-crediting period, i.e. while credits are actually being sold versus after projects have already been sold and the project's just in long-term kind of administrative mode. And so specifically, though, within the current protocol, within both the ARB protocol as well as most voluntary protocols, there are specific requirements and language that would most likely need modification before one could, use remote sensing, with abandon, or use it, kind of to its full potential. And so part of that is specific language talking about, requiring inventory plots and sampling parameters for those plots, which includes the DBH down to 1/10 of an inch and height of all the trees on that plot. And that's to feed into some very specific volumetric equations that the California program requires that you use for all your calculations. Another protocol requirement is that the sampling error needs to be less than needs to be less than 20% of the inventory mean at the 90% confidence interval. And ideally, you really want it as low as 5%. Otherwise, there's an additional penalty you pay in terms of deductions for inventory uncertainty. And then finally, there are specific required pools, including standing deadwood, which need to be measured and noted as such. And the verification protocols, also call for visiting and sampling a minimum number of plots within each strata. And finally, there are also specific modeling requirements, specific growth projection models, which can be used, and I've provided the list from the California program there. And so any data that's required to basically manage those models needs to be gathered somehow. Other potential barriers and just questions, relate to the ability to yield that level of carbon visibility and uneven age management scenarios, differentiating between somewhat similar species that do have, say, different specific gravity numbers that impact their carbon calculations. Again, just more kind of complex for us. Things get trickier, and the value of boots on the ground seemingly, really goes up. So in terms of ways to speed the adoption of remote sensing in whatever form, there's a variety of pathways to consider. And so the first is to, engage directly with the California Air Resources Board that oversees the cap and trade program, or with one of the voluntary carbon standards to actually get the technology incorporated in the protocol itself, or in, an addendum or module that could be used in association with one of those protocols. And I think there's, a lot of reasons why it's in everybody's interest to do so. Everybody acknowledges that currently carbon projects really don't have the potential to reach small landowners who represent and who hold the majority of forest lands in the country. And tapping that would deliver both great conservation benefits as well as increasing the potential supply of quality offsets to the market. And just one other place to look at this is, perhaps starting with more comfortable position of providing language to incentivize the development of this for post-credit monitoring could be helpful. So other ways to do that, in parallel with engaging the standards, actually gathering on the ground data to provide the ground truthing of whatever technology is being evaluated. And we have been in discussions with different CMS participants and some ideas for that. I would suggest speaking with Professor Hurt for any specifics on how this may or may not be used within their efforts. So even in the absence of a new protocol overhaul, there are some ways to begin using this data and using it to support the inventory process or the monitoring process, and even without protocol changes, being able to demonstrate some benefits to all parties from that, in the form of hopefully reducing the number of plots that are required for an inventory, or at a minimum requiring the frequency within, with which one needs to go back and resample it to maintain the accuracy of the model. Our perspective is that probably the inventory side of things is the easiest initial path. There's additional levels of requirements and restrictions around the verification process and protocol that would probably be harder to change. And moreover, the known existence of this ongoing verification process, perhaps relying on more ground-based methods, would provide an initial check on the inventory and monitoring calculations, as well as additional ground truthing. And so just one final thought, beyond trying to team up with and looking at data from existing projects, it could really be a two-way street, and that, a lot of people on the phone spend a lot of time looking at carbon stocks in different parts of the country. And so if you are seeing potential properties or areas that seem to have carbon stocks significantly above what similar forests located in the area look like, that could very well be a carbon project. And if one did occur on that area, that could be a proof of concept of your own technologies, as well as providing a free flow of valuable data for ground truthing the sensing technology. And one relatively easy way to do that is BlueSource does provide for any property owner a free eligibility assessment and estimate of carbon revenue potential from the property looking forward 10 years and then looking out at what those really long-term commitments look like economically as well. And we just do that as a way of getting to know different property owners and forest owners, and hopefully identify some carbon opportunities for them. And so I will pause there. I've seen a few questions come in over the course of that, but we wanted to set aside the majority of the remainder of our time to address those and other questions.
Kevin, Jeff, if you want to go right ahead into the chat box and go over the questions that were sent over to you, and then we'll facilitate questions that are in the room.
Hey, since this is Kevin, since Jeff just wrapped up speaking, I'll give him a chance to address some of the questions that, or give him a chance to read through some of the questions that are more in his camp, and I'll just maybe skip down a few to some that are in my camp. I'll start with Hudagazi's question. The question being, we know that there's not an open market for carbon, so how can we evaluate the carbon price? And the answer to that is you're right in the sense that there are a lot of bilateral over-the-counter transactions that contribute to the carbon market, and it is tough to know what the carbon price is. However, there are several open mechanisms by which the market becomes aware of carbon pricing. So the first, with respect to the California program, would be the quarterly auctions that occur of carbon allowances, and those results are always published within a few days of those. And so we do know what allowances are selling for in what we call the primary market. And then the secondary to that, there is an exchange, most notably the Intercontinental Exchange, or ICE, where these carbon allowances trade on a daily basis, and one can go in and look at those real-time or daily closing prices for those allowance instruments as well. And allowances are a very big informant of carbon offset prices for the California market, and so a lot of the transaction values are based on those allowances, but they account for the different risks that are associated with offsets. There are also a series of brokers in the space that produce daily reports on what transaction values they perceive there being for carbon offsets in both the California and the voluntary markets. And so there are daily prices that can be checked out there. And then lastly, with respect to voluntary only, there is an excellent report that's produced every year by the folks at Ecosystem Marketplace and New Energy Finance that does a very in-depth deep dive of the voluntary carbon markets and does very robust price assessments. It's an excellent analysis. The only challenge with it is that it comes out a year after everything has happened, or a few months after everything has happened. So I hope that answered your question, but there are ways in which it is quite assess the carbon price.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I can take a shot at some of these other ones. Sustainable harvesting seems a zero-sum game in terms of sequestration. I guess the way to think about it is the carbon benefit is calculated on a stock basis. And so year on year, net growth is calculated and added to the existing carbon stock, and the difference between that carbon stock and the flat baseline stock, can be calculated. And the sustainable harvesting requirement is simply meant to ensure that those stocks which are being removed are being handled in as relatively benign a way is desirable. Eased and uneased lands, so eased lands are lands with conservation easements that have been donated or sold on them. Typically, they prevent the conversion of a property to a non-forest use. Some conservation easements, that's all that they really try to do, is prevent that use to something else. Other easements impose kind of more and more, or potentially more and more restrictive degrees of restrictions around forest forest harvest management, which is allowed, and in some cases, can ban timber harvesting as well. And so uneased properties are simply those that don't have an easement. And so under the California Under Protocols, properties that have easements, either historic easements or anticipated future easements, are all potentially eligible as carbon projects, and they are actually required for avoided conversion projects. Patrick Hogan also said an entity that agrees to forest management could change their mind at any time and thereby make any previous CMS irrelevant. They could in theory, but the annual monitoring that they need to undertake to the carbon program, they're supposed to be reporting carbon stocks on an annual basis, and again going out in the field and confirming those stocks every 6 years. So, while the previous CMS analysis would be irrelevant, there would have to be a subsequent analysis that still was undertaken to document what that change was, and those analyses previously would need to be ongoing for 100 years unless somebody terminated the project. Let's see.
Jeff, I'll just add on to that. If the project is terminated, then there's a hefty penalty of usually essentially replacing all of the offsets that were issued to the project to begin with. Yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. And then finally, Mr. Rosenberg, what are the protocol changes you're suggesting? Just simply the, it seems like under both voluntary and compliance programs that, make little, or as far as I know, no mention of some of these technologies, either proactively developing a methodology that incorporates some remote sensing technologies, or at least removes some of the specific technical and statistical requirements included in the current inventory methodology, so that at least other approaches would, have, a more equal footing.
Maybe I'll take over here and just address Jessica McCarty's question. Jessica, you'd asked if there was a URL for the daily carbon price report. So again, there are a series of these. The daily ones are reports that are produced by various environmental brokers. I'm aware of 3 of them, but that produce these daily reports. But I'm cautious not to play favorites and upset anyone, so I would encourage you to just use a web search for environmental commodities brokerage or carbon offset brokerage, and the firms that I'm referring to may not pop to the top of the list, but there's some big names in the space, and just by requesting that you get on their mailing list, you will receive those daily emails. You can also navigate the site of the Intercontinental Exchange, or ICE, to arrive at the daily closing prices for the allowances. And then finally, with respect to the quarterly auctions, you can go to the California Air Resources Board Cap and Trade webpage, and I believe that you can subscribe to their mailing list, and you would then get auction reports as well as some other useful information about the program.
Thanks, Kevin. Mr. Rosenberg again asked a question about, would those protocol changes suggest a less rigorous monitoring system? And I certainly don't mean to imply that. I think, certainly it's important for everybody involved in these things to maintain confidence that, the level of rigor is there. I think what I'm suggesting is just changing some specific requirements to enable other technologies or other approaches that can be shown to maintain the same or provide better rigor.
Great. Are there any questions, Libby or Caitlin? Do you guys have any questions for Kevin or Jeff? Let's see, I don't know if this was addressed. I think, Jeff, I think you may have addressed the eased and uneased lands directly for Mark Rosenberg. I think, yeah.
Yeah, I
think
I
we've
did.
covered all of them. Yes, I'm going through making sure we've hit all of them. I think we're good to go. Are there any more questions online for Kevin or Jeff, please? Okay, we have one question here. Go ahead, Caitlin.
This is Caitlin from the University of Maryland working on the CMS project. First off, thank you for the great talk, very informative. Excited to learn more. Just generally, I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about this 3 to 8 year invalidation period with the requirement of, if you can find that they have more than 5% error. I guess, and I'll have to look at the models that are required to make all these volumetric equations, but can you maybe just talk about a little bit more about the error and how stringent those measurements are? Thanks.
Yeah, Kevin, do you want to address that, or would you like me to?
Yeah, maybe I'll start it off and just speak to the invalidation principles in general and the modes of invalidation, and then Jeff, if at the end of that I have inadequately addressed the specific question about the 5% threshold, then please feel free to jump in. So the invalidation provisions are, quite frankly, one of the most difficult set of provisions to work within the constructs of, just because they're complex when you sort of apply them, when you move them from a regulatory context to a real-world context and try to assess the risk of invalidation on a particular project or a particular offset. So there are 3 ways in which a credit can be invalidated, and this is irrespective of whether it's 8 or 3 years. But the 3 modes are, one is if the credits were essentially fraudulently double sold, if they were maybe created in a voluntary program and in the California compliance program, and someone was trying to claim monetary value for both programs, which would, I call it fraud. I don't think the regulation refers to it as that, but that's essentially what we're talking about. So that one's really easy to grasp. The second is a 5% overage, which is if in a subsequent verification it is found that a verification body finds that a previous credit issuance issued an amount of credits that is overstating what should have been credited by more than 5%, and then whatever that overage is would be invalidated. In the case of fraud, in the first example I gave, the first mode of invalidation, up to 100% of the project's offsets or the offsets from that reporting period can be invalidated. And the third example, which is actually the most difficult for us as project developers and for industries to ascertain, is the risk, or is the fact that a project must be in compliance with all environmental health and safety laws, and that includes local, state, and federal laws, during the reporting period. And it sounds very simple, but when you actually put it into practice, it can be difficult to ascertain what would be a violation that would be worthy of invalidation, eligible for invalidation. And so to address your specific question around 3 versus 8 year, every offset that is created under the California program starts out with an 8-year invalidation risk, and then in the case of forestry, going back into the field and with a different verification body and doing a full field re-verification, if that is ultimately successful, then that invalidation period may be reduced from 8 to 3 years. And so I hope that answered your question.
I can't really add to that.
Yeah, that was informative. Thank you.
There's one more comment online from Mr. Rosenberg, wondering if one should consider a conservative estimate for sale of credits to cover any error. And that isn't what we recommend to clients. We recommend coming up with the most accurate estimate of credits, which are in fact associated with the benefits being generated, and then we undertake a lot of work to make sure that we're on track with that and hire a good verifier to confirm that, and then the good folks over at the registries look at it as do people at ARB. So a lot of good eyes look at this, and we have confidence in the process, and we just try and get the numbers as right as we can.
Great, thank you. And we have one last question. Go ahead, Sabrina.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Jeff. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I was wondering if you could just touch upon a little bit on your work, maybe in Guatemala or Kenya, your international work, and maybe a little bit on the relationship that you have with projects like the Paradigm Project to scale the projects internationally. Thank you.
You bet. So both of the projects that you mentioned are efficient cook stove projects, one in Guatemala and the other in Kenya, but expanding throughout East Africa. These are really phenomenal projects. They do have forest carbon implications, although that's not the primary mechanism. So what they are is the Paradigm Project was founded by one of Source's co-founders and a gentleman by the name of Greg Spencer, and they manufacture and distribute efficient cooking stoves to rural poor around the world. As some of you may know, 2 billion people in the world cook over an open fire, which is the #1 cause of child mortality in the world due to lower respiratory disease, equivalent to smoking about 40 packs a day just by cooking over an open fire in a homestead. And so what an efficient cook stove does is it reduces fuel consumption by up to about 2/3, and it also increases combustion efficiency, thereby improving the air quality in the home. It also has tremendous economic impacts for impoverished households. It's expected, third-party analyses have shown that a cook stove generates about a 5,000% rate of return for a poor family. It provides tremendous time and household income savings, health benefits, and then massive avoided deforestation because families at least in Western Kenya, typically consume, don't quote me on this, but I think it's around 19 trees a year. And so if you can dramatically cut into that, there are some massive benefits that are associated with forest preservation with these types of projects. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, it did. Thank you. Okay. We are, and I want to extend a very warm thank you to Jeff and Kevin. That was actually very informative, and we're going to have a follow-up discussion with George Hurt here in about a half hour. But for anybody that is interested in listening to this talk again or looking at the slides, it will be made available online through the CMS Applications tab on the carbon.nasa.gov website. And our next speaker for the CMS Policy Series will be Tuesday, May 26th. And that will be our speaker, Eric Schwab from the National Aquarium. And so thank you again for everyone who participated. And on behalf of CMS and the JCCC, we appreciate you all attending.